Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. And in this program today we have a special interview with a sports journalist and broadcaster, and we'll be asking why he's made that transition from sport to defending Israel and the Jewish people. And we'll also be asking, could Israel host the 2030 World Cup? A warm welcome to the programme, and we have a famous sports broadcaster today. His name is Jonny Gould. Jonny, warm welcome to the Middle East Report.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Simon.
Likewise. And Jonny, before we talk about your incredible sports career in journalism and broadcasting, you've worked for Talk Radio, you've worked for the BBC, and you've worked for Sky Sports, and I could quite happily interview about your experience dealing with football and sport as well. But you know, we're here to talk about Israel and the Middle East. But can you share with us something about your family background and your parents being Holocaust survivors and how they came to the UK to make a home for themselves, and what was your life like growing up being Jewish?
The answer to that, Simon, is that I grew up in a very well-established Jewish community in Birmingham. The synagogue we went to was built in the 1850s, and many generations of Jewish people had prayed there. The sadness, though, was that the community was declining even in my time there. And sadly, I've also contributed to that demise by leaving the city for London, where I live now with my family. There's still a Jewish community there, but for a big city like Birmingham, it's quite small. But the forefathers, should we say, for want of a better word, the Brummie forefathers built an institution there which still exists in quite some pomp and provides services for the smaller Jewish community. There are other synagogues as well. Again, on the decline, but still vibrant in their way. And actually, there was a spirit of tolerance and establishment. On one side, as you say, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and on my father's side, they were Brummies, Jewish Brummies, but had been there for something like 140 years. Wow. So my father was born in Birmingham, like me. My grandfather even was born in Birmingham, but his father moved to Birmingham as a child in the 1860s. However, my mother's family arrived in 1939 from Vienna. And when you consider the timeline of them arriving in Birmingham from cosmopolitan Vienna, I put that in inverted commas because it turned out not to be very much. My grandfather, was living in Vienna 6 months after Kristallnacht had happened. And I mean, the idea that he could maintain a life there of sorts before being able to come to this blessed land with its opportunities and his ticket to survival is quite something to behold. And that sort of patriotism, that belief in British values comes from very much my mother's father's side. The idea of this country stood up to the tyranny of Nazism and gave him a good life with his wife, my grandmother, and brought up two children, my mum and my uncle. And the rest is history, as they say. So this is a great country. Here I am living here with my children in freedom to practice religion, to practice life, both secular and religious, and long may that continue.
Amen to that. I agree with you. And Jonny, share with us where your passion for sport came from, that you decided to pursue a career in sports journalism.
I think I'm probably the first generation to be able to benefit from being able to secure employment from outside, the family business, so to speak. Not that they couldn't have done that, but the opportunities weren't there. So my dad had his own business, and before that he was in his grandfather's business, which was a tailoring business. On my mother's side, my grandfather was a typewriter mechanic and set up his own typewriter store, which is, I think, probably the equivalent of being an IT operator now. They enabled me to sort of go out there and pass English exams and be a journo, which is a kind of form of assimilation in a way. It's a way of being perhaps more English than perhaps my parents and grandparents were. And so I went about it and imbibed football like other children imbibe air, and became a sports journalist the hard way, in the sense that I read the papers every day and phoned up the radio stations, got myself in there. I was very lucky at 17 years old to have a deep voice, a good microphone voice. And I was really in broadcasting from the age of 18, skipped university, didn't need to do that. One of the wonderful things about journalism, and it still remains today, that actually it's one of the only white-collar careers that you can have without going to university, which I think long may that continue as well, because it's an intellectual route for all sorts of people. I think of Andrew Pierce. Again, I mean, his story, he was in a Swindon Comprehensive. I don't think he went to university, and he's become a very eminent journalist. And I think this is one of the great things about British journalism, that you don't have to intellectualize it. You've just got to try and have a good brain and a turn of phrase. And I'm extremely lucky, and sport has been very good to me.
Excellent. So can you share with us some of the big media companies that you've worked for? I mean, you're involved in Channel 4's Italia Football.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that in the 90s with Paul Gascoigne with his move to Lazio, together with Sky Sports. So for me to switch off from what's going on in the world, I love to watch Sky Sports, and just to get up to date with some of the sports knowledge and what have you. I'm an Arsenal fan, so we're not doing so well at the moment, but I'm a huge England fan, so it's great to see that under Gareth Southgate the England team have progressed so far, and the first time in my lifetime it looks like we have a team that might win a major tournament. So share with us some of the media companies that you've worked for, some of the big matches that you provided analysis for, because it's a quite remarkable thing you've been involved in.
It's been, as I say, extremely good for me, and very supportive, and I've made lots of friends, not just journalists but players as well, some very good people, and I've worked, just going backwards, at the moment Talk Radio is where I'm working. That's not in sport, that's in news and current affairs and programming, so I get to speak to some incredible people on a wide variety of subjects. Going back, I was a newspaper reviewer at Sky News for about a decade. For that, I have Eamon Holmes to be grateful for, because Eamon said, why don't you do it? And again, it was just general news rather than sport itself. And before that, I was doing the morning sport on Smooth Radio, which came to an end. And so that's where my transition from sport into news happened. And from there, obviously, the Jewish podcasting, which I guess we'll talk about later. Before that, I was working for Independent Radio News as the sports editor, BBC World Service, which gave me a tremendous eye-opening grasp of how important English is around the world. Broadcasting to what they claimed 150 million people around the world, speaking in English to people who wanted to learn English. And you suddenly realize the power of our language to cross borders like perhaps no other language. It's the second most widely spoken language in the world, behind Chinese, but that's not really talked much beyond its borders. So English is our tremendous soft power in the world, and that was really revealed to me back at the BBC World Service 30 years ago. And again, I'm grateful for the amazing people that I worked with there who had those accents which seemed most improbable. So people like Pamela Crichton and Paddy Feeney. These are people from the Light programme, and things that your grandma or dad or mum would tell you. about. And to sort of carry the baton from that standard to today is a great gift, and I have a wonderful memory of that place. And I've worked at other places too, too numerous to mention, Talk Sport as well. But I think my future probably lies away from sport now. Not that I don't accept sports opportunities when they come along. I'm effectively the sports correspondent on I-24, which is the Israeli news channel. They phone me up whenever they want a FIFA or UEFA story. That seems to be what they're most interested in.
And your most recent one was to comment on the possibility that through the Abraham Accords that Israel could host the World Cup, which we can talk on later in the programme, but no, it's a very good interview. So what happened? Because we have to really discuss this, because this is a big change. You went from sports journalism and broadcasting, which is quite incredible, a bit into news broadcasting, and now you've developed your own podcast where you defend Israel, you defend the Jewish people. But how did that come about, and what are the circumstances?
I think what's been central to me is a passion for what I do, and it really drives me to do that. And I think it should drive everyone.
Absolutely.
If you're going to be the best, if you're going to be a road sweeper, be the best one you can be. I always wanted to be as good a sports journalist and presenter as I was. I was involved in my own business called Sports Media for about 25 years, and we built up a radio network providing sports bulletins funded by sponsorship to about 200 radio stations, among them global radios, Capital Gold Radio, as well as Jazz FM, as well as Planet Rock, and many national and local radio stations around the country, the Eagle in Guildford, amongst others around the country, and it thrived on a diversity of ownership. Now, radio suddenly contracted, and local radio has all but disappeared from our dial. And if the proof be that radio stations around the country, instead of being named after their local river as they were in the 70s, 80s and 90s, they're now called Capital or Heart. And that's a shame, because local radio really provides an infrastructure for its city. It's an identity like its river.
Absolutely.
But not to the corporate world, and I think that's something that's really missing. So much so that I don't think I could start my career as it was in the 80s now. I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably be a social media Johnny, like everyone. But the great thing about radio is it can distinguish you. It does give you a platform, it gives you a narrative and a voice, and I was able to talk to my people, my city, which was a wonderful thing to behold. So the passion started to appear to me on news and current affairs, which started at Sky News. I did that for a decade, doing the newspapers. Jeremy Corbyn came along, and I was on 2 or 3 times a month. And if there was a Jeremy Corbyn story, if there was a Labour story, if there was a fight against anti-Semitism, or if there was something that particularly alerted me, I would cover it. Not to take advantage of my position, but because I thought it was a very important issue facing British people and the electorate, and Sky News was an environment to do that. Newspapers gave you a platform to be opinionated. It wasn't reportage in that way. It was narrative, and then that progressed to podcasting. Why don't I cover podcasts? I approached BBC Local Radio in London, inspired by the late, great Michael Friedland, who did a show throughout the 70s and 80s called You Don't Have to Be Jewish, which was a wonderful trip through contemporary Jewish issues of the 70s and 80s. So, for example, imprisoned Soviet Jewry, Sammy Davis Jr. converting to Judaism, which is the most improbable story. Wonderful musical stories, The Fiddler on the Roof, and that it was for that time Israel in the 1970s and 80s. And I thought, well, there's a great opportunity here. Michael sadly passed away several years ago, and I spoke to Jonathan, his son, and I said, well, why don't we produce something, that would broaden Jewish listenership on local radio? And I got an answer which was most disappointing. They do multicultural output on BBC London, but there was no room for Jewish output among it. So I took that as a bit of a sock in the gob, actually, I must say. So I thought, right, what's podcasting? It is the possibility of mainstream output and broadening listenership beyond licensed radio. So I attach all the values of journalism, mainstream journalism, to an international output, a bit like Revelation TV, in English, right across the world. 3 years later, 75 or so episodes on, I'm delighted to say that I have audience across the world. The UK is still the #1 audience. US is #2, Israel is #3, Canada #4, Australia 5. That's not surprising. What is surprising is that I have audience not just in the countries that have signed the Abraham Accords with Israel, but I also have them in Gaza, and Judea and Samaria and Iran and Lebanon. And it's the language of peace. It's the language of normalization. It's about Jewish values. It's about talking above the noise.
No, absolutely.
It's very important.
So when you made that transition to sport to current affairs, and knowing how our mainstream media has covered Israel's defensive conflicts, such as in Gaza 2014, the most recent conflict we saw last May as well, when Israel is coming under attack from Hamas, who are a genocidal terrorist organization that hide behind women and children when they fire their rockets and missiles. They want a large number of civilian deaths in order to win international sympathy around the world. How difficult is it when you're on the mainstream media to comment on these stories, knowing that there is pretty much an anti-Israel agenda going on from our mainstream media when it comes to Israel's narrative and telling Israel's narrative, so that news is never ever put in context? We're never ever told who Hamas are, their ideology, and instead this is Israel being the David against Goliath, and it's portrayed the other way around.
You're right. You've put it, Simon, in a way that I would probably put it myself. We're up against it, and the oppressors as the victims as the oppressors. It is extremely difficult to get through. As you say, rockets indiscriminately fired from Gaza. 15% of them don't even reach Israeli territory. Who knows how many Gazans were killed by their own terrorists? Who knows? Israel has Iron Dome, which changes the whole mechanism of war. It enables Israel not to go in and fight a terrible war which would enact losses on both sides. We have very influential cheerleaders in popular culture. I was blocked by Gary Lineker when he accused Israel of, one-sidedly, I must say, bombing a Gaza tower block with journalists in it and killing people. Listen, every sovereign country in the world makes mistakes. But as Senator Ambassador Michael Oren said to me, does that mean if a sovereign nation makes a mistake, they should be denied statehood? And Gary Lineker blocked me because I told him, I said, you have a duty to social cohesion. And I was referring specifically to his complaint at the same time as that group of Blackburn youths got in their car and drove through St John's Wood on the Finchley Road in London and started megaphoning for the rape and murder of young Jewish females. That was a terrible moment. People can see it out their window. Don't go out with a skull cap, a koppel on. Don't go out. Stay indoors and look out the window. Frightening. And the Palestinian flag was portrayed after the cup final. Leicester City versus Chelsea. Paul Pogba picked one up at Manchester United. An Aston Villa player picked one up and was photographed with a steward in support. On one level, it's an act of Palestinian patriotism. On the other hand, it's an act of aggression against Jews. And a lot of people do not understand that. They do not appreciate it, and they still won't, and they still will not listen to that. one has to fight for one's citizenship, for one's British values, what one believes in. And sadly, I have been blocked by Lineker. I think that's to his shame, actually, I must say. I think it's important to have that dialogue, because if I was allowed to have that discussion with him, Stephen Fry's another one who called the West Bank the worst place I've ever seen in the world. These people have got millions of followers. They have a duty to social cohesion, and I'm afraid they're not playing their part. And I thank you, Simon, for being able to say that on this channel. No,
it's an absolute pleasure. And of course, one of the main reasons why I kind of set up the Middle East report was to put Israel's viewpoint across, but also to put Israel in the context of the most hostile, dangerous region of the world, and also the threats that Israel faces from the likes of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the danger that extreme regime poses to Israel, because without it, you wouldn't have the support of Hamas, the support of Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. But it seems like our media don't understand the way that these countries are working. They don't understand its strategic operative of using the media in order to influence public opinion, and that in turn influences government policy. So of course, Hamas want to see the largest number of civilian casualties. They want journalists then to report their narrative, and told, if you don't report our narrative, then your life is in danger, under threat. And then our mainstream media swallows the lies of Hamas or Hezbollah or the Islamic Republic of Iran, carries their narrative that demonizes Israel to the extent that our own precious Jewish community that you come from come under attack. You have to have security guards at your schools and your synagogues, and your community becomes threatened because the mainstream media don't give Israel that level playing ground that she deserves, being the only true democracy in the Middle East.
Again, you've made the point extremely succinctly. Rockets are still being fired in from Gaza because, tragically, both sides, after the latest Gazan war, can claim some form of advantage, and that is the worst thing to say about it, because according to Israeli military intelligence, there are still 7,000 rockets ready to be fired from Gaza into Israel. At least that was the figure at the end of the latest Gaza war. Israel, of course, is able to fire 91% of those rockets out of the sky using the miracle of Iron Dome. And there were strategic victories in terms of some of the tunnels being destroyed, and some of the use of, for the first time, social media to try and show that Israel was sending an army to invade. It wasn't, it was subterfuge. And the Gazan soldiers got into position and were bombed. And of course, that was a strategic victory. These are human beings I'm talking about. I don't glorify that. I don't like it. These are all sickening things. And it's like teeing up another war. And that's the worst thing I can say about it. We don't want war. We want normalization and peace. There is positive noise going on. Of course, Jonny Gould, in episode 63 of Jonny Gould's Jewish State, said he is positively surprised, quoting him literally, of the durability of the Abraham Accords 1 year on, despite Trump's defeat and Biden coming in with John Kerry, them taking the view of the JCPOA deal of Iran. UAE and Bahrain, they have their reasons for maintaining the Abraham Accords. We're hearing the jungle drums that Saudi Arabia's normalization with Israel is coming, but there probably won't be a signature, because why would they sign one at the moment? So they can do what the UAE have done for many years, which is cooperate on a quiet level. But to quote a football score, Abraham Accords 1, Oslo Accords 0.
No, absolutely.
It's going well.
So should we take a look at one of your podcasts? And this is our final one with His Excellency, the UAE's ambassador to the UK.
This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Developing links and bridges through prosperity and economic prosperity and collaboration, cooperation is the way where you can actually exercise positive leverage over one another. And also we feel that from that we can probably find ways to dialogue with the Israelis, particularly over issues such as the Palestinian cause, with more effect and more leverage. You know, I think it's one that's a natural course.
Normalization is possibly the most understated word to describe the seismic changes triggered by the Abraham Accords. Israel, the UAE and Bahrain enter a new period of peace and understanding brokered by President Donald Trump's US administration and signed at the White House. But the speed by which the peoples of Israel and the UAE are realizing the opportunities made possible by diplomacy is really quite breathtaking. Expressions of religious similarity and mutual understanding, physical and economic links, and recognition of multiple opportunities they deliver hourly headlines across the world, including this interview, recorded just as the Knesset in Israel ratified the treaties. And so it is to this prestigious episode, which wouldn't have been possible even a month before. But what of the Palestinians? What difference to their future can normalization provide? Can this peace create positive leverage in the face of Palestinian rejectionism? Here is His Excellency Mansour Abulhoul, the UAE Ambassador to the United Kingdom. And as you watch, listen and subscribe to the podcast.
His Excellency, the UAE Ambassador Mansour Abulhoul to Jonny Gould's Jewish State. A warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you. A pleasure to join you, Jonny, and looking forward to our discussion today.
Now, you have strong personal ties to the UK. Your mother, who's lived in the UAE since 1968, was actually born in Britain. She's from Cambridge. And you also attended school here and Leeds University, where you studied Arabic and politics. And you've described the UK and the UAE to have so many connections culturally, politically, etc.
That's absolutely true. I mean, I really see two halves of my life coming together. You couldn't put it better, Jonny. And it's one that, you know, it's a 200-year historic relationship. It was our first embassy that we opened, and we have, you know, a burgeoning British community in the UAE. Over 100,000 Brits live there. So, I mean, there's strong ties. We have many Emiratis who have invested in property here, students that study here. It's a deep relationship at the bilateral level. So it's one that we really celebrate. And in fact, next year is the UAE's Golden Jubilee. So we'll be celebrating 50 years of relations with the UK, and I look forward to the next 50 years. It's been a busy year for us, a busy summer for us, should I put rather, with the launch of the Hope Mars mission probe, you know, and so a very exciting one. And yeah, we look forward to the next 50 years.
So let's just talk about the immense and very sudden change of political climate in the Middle East. What does normalization with Israel mean to the United Arab Emirates?
I think it's one that has, you know, it's certainly a historic breakthrough, you know, and one that the brilliance of it, I think it was kept very tight and very much under wraps for good reason. But there's been, you know, there has been a trend if we look back and certain indications that where you see two very dynamic nations and economies in the region, and eventually, you know, that sort of convergence for good reason, for peace and prosperity. But along the way, it's one that's grown and developed from, if I think back to the UAE securing the award of hosting IRENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, and of course Israel having a permanent representative there, through to next year where Israel will have a pavilion and delegation, and we hope many Israeli tourists will visit. So I think it's one back to smaller developments, but important ones where we've invited Israeli sports athletes to compete in major events in the UAE. So it's one that has been, you're quite right, progressive, but certainly I think the sort of breakthrough on the diplomatic front here was one that really, I think, was a pleasant surprise for everyone.
There you go. There's an example of one of Jonny Gould's podcasts. What a coup, I must add, to get the ambassador to the UK belonging to the United Arab Emirates 2 weeks after Israel's historic signing of the Abraham Accords. Now, this is another thing, because there seems to be a parallel narrative going on in our kind of mainstream media's coverage. We saw the signings of the Abraham Accords in Washington, D.C. at the White House, a big triumph for the Trump administration, but most of our mainstream media hardly ever covered it. They don't actually look into the fact that one of the biggest successes of the Abraham Accords is that Israel's been able to reach peace. And it's not only, it's not like a cold peace between Jordan and Egypt, but this is a normalization. This is something that Israel has dreamed about being involved in the Middle East, that recognition that she has a right to live in the Middle East and a right to normalizations. And yet we don't really see that narrative coming across on our mainstream media. Instead they tend to ignore the success of the Abraham Accords. You have to be an Israel specialist or understand what's happening in the Middle East to know this, but you wouldn't get this if you watched our mainstream news. Why do you think that's the case?
I think that's absolutely right. It's a genuine, warm peace. It's, when we go back to the 70s and we remember Begin and Sadat's peace, that was a very personal, warm speech, warm peace, and that grew out of a very personal relationship between Begin and Sadat. And amazingly, even through a period of Muslim Brotherhood running Egypt, it survived. It's been cold from time to time, it's had its tensions, but it still exists. The Hashemite kingdom in Jordan and the peace deals signed with Israel in 1994 still exists. It's a strategic peace. It has been emboldened, I think, by the Abraham Accords. It's got stronger. Flights allowed now over Jordan in a way that they weren't exactly allowed before. So that's got better. But again, it's not exactly a warm peace. But the one with the Gulf states, with the UAE and Bahrain, is truly genuine. The dynamics of the two countries, as His Excellency said in that clip, thank you for playing that one.
Pleasure.
He said, the countries are similar. They're a similar age. The UAE he regards as a peacemaking country. That's what Israel's job is as well in the world. They are both, he's got trying to send Emirati to the moon, just as Israel tried to do a couple of years ago. It is a very dynamic piece. There's lots of trade going on between them. I just think, actually, I put this to Tim Marshall, who told me he voted Remain, and he's out there as a Remain voter, but that's the extent of his discussions on Brexit. He doesn't want to talk about it, and who can blame him for that position? But I suggested to him that a lot of Brexit voters might have been tempted to vote Remain if we could see a model that Israel, the UAE and Bahrain and Sudan have put together, where they will never be ideologically the same. They are separate Arab, Jewish nations, all pluralistic in their way, but very, very different top religious ideas and ideologies. But they trade together in a way that I think that the single market was planned for when we agreed to join the EEC back in the 70s. And I think that the success of the Israel, UAE and Bahrain relationships in particular is a challenge to Southern Europe, to the countries that are nearby, the Cypruses, the Italys, the Maltas. Because if the nation states as peace-loving countries can come together but still be separate, why isn't that a future construct of the European Union, rather than, as Brendan O'Neill referred to me, as the happy clappy borders of the EU? Obviously he is an arch Brexiteer, a very famous commentator in Brexit issues. So it's a wonderful showcase, I think, for the possibilities of peace in the Middle East. That's one of my jobs, I think, on Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Absolutely, and you've had a lot of interesting guests. I think I've interviewed some of the guests you've had on your podcast. And can you describe what it was like to interview Tuvia Tellenbaum? I mean, he's the famous author, writes famous books like Catch the Jew, and does these really fascinating reports on pretty much anti-Semitism and the BDS and others. And he's a real life character. That's probably the best way to describe him.
He is totally uncompromising in his views, and he carries a very religious message. He is from a religious background, but he's now living in a secular environment. But as I say, he is a man of religious conviction. He is from Kfar Saba in Israel, but lives in Germany amongst other places, and he says the message: you have to stand up for your rights or you face annihilation. And he doesn't just mean a Holocaust-style reminder of the Jewish plight, but he also is talking about everyone everywhere, that you have to stand up for yourself, otherwise you'll be overrun. He believes in, obviously, Jewish people protecting themselves, but not hiding. So that if you have a synagogue and there is a security issue, don't take the name of the synagogue down. Don't hide the windows. Say it's a synagogue, because if you start at any time to compromise your values for the sake of that, you may well face annihilation. And that's his message. And he was shocked by the state of Great Britain and anti-Semitism here in his latest book, which I was fortunate to interview him twice about during the making of the book, and later on as well, The Taming of the Jew, a little play on Shakespeare, but also a message to our communal leaders not to hide, not to appease, to be Jewish and to lead religious lives, not just Jewish people, but Christians as well as Muslims, everyone.
Absolutely. So let's have a look at Jonny Gould interviewing Tuvia Tellenbaum.
This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Tuvia Tellenbaum, journalist and filmmaker, using extraordinary undercover methods to expose anti-Semitism in the UK, and chronicled in his latest book, The Taming of the Jew.
Hi, my name is Ahmad, and I'm from Palestine. Would you like to, I'll point in the camera, the video camera, and I say, would you like to say some words for to my brothers and sisters from Palestine? And yes, of course. When you see these nice kids, look like innocent and naive and studious and everything, well dressed, and the first thing is, free Palestine. And then he apologizes that up to this day, he has not yet picked up arms to join the battle. And it's like, you really think I'm Palestinian? You think everybody in my community, nobody looks like a Palestinian. So you don't even know what a Palestinian looks like. Some people did not know the distance, when I asked them this stupid question, between Jerusalem and Palestine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not that they know anything, really.
Yes.
It's just either consciously or subconsciously, on the other side there are Jews.
You're pretty much traveling without restriction because you can.
What do you mean without restriction? Hamburg is full of restrictions.
Yes, but I've seen you in other places around Europe over the last year.
Me, myself, personally, yes.
Yeah.
Personally, yes.
Yeah.
But the country as a whole is under a huge lockdown.
It is my absolute pleasure to welcome back to Jonny Gould's Jewish State, Tuvia Tellenbaum. Hello,
and it's
sir.
my absolute pleasure to be with you again, Jonny Gould.
You are a true free speech doyen.
So that was Tuvia Tellenbaum, who's also been on the Middle East Report. Looked like you guys were having fun there with our podcast.
He is. He's become a great friend. I mean, one of the things I've built up a very unlikely contacts book of people who are genuinely friends. So His Excellency Mansour Abul Hul. I wish him a happy Eid Mubarak whenever the festival is, and it's not every 12 months, isn't it? It's quite quick. It comes around quite fast. Tuvia has become a friend, and so has the mighty Colonel Richard Kemp as well. I'm in touch with everyone via WhatsApp along the way. Lord Leslie Turnberg sits near me in synagogue as well, the author of a book on the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, talking in some detail about Sir Arthur. And of course he was Prime Minister as well. He's most famous for the Balfour Declaration, but of course he was also Prime Minister. It's been a wonderful experience and a very sobering one. The idea that, like us here now, Simon, you can sit down with a cup of tea and have a chat, or coffee, have a cup of coffee and sit down and just have a chat like the good old days.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why I love this programme. And the fact that we got an hour means that we can explore some of the big topics affecting Israel and the Middle East today. And instead of just a couple of minutes focus on a particular subject, I think our news has definitely been dumbed down over the last few years. Our news has become sanitised. Our journalists are not discussing the real issues, and the main stories are not on our mainstream media. And that's the sad state of affairs that we're living. So it's important, I think, for yourself and for myself as well, is to put the record straight when it comes to Israel. Now, a regular guest on this programme is Colonel Richard Kemp, and he's become a friend of yours, and I think he's become one of the most remarkable spokesmen on behalf of Israel. What do you think that makes Colonel Richard Kemp so special when he talks about Israel?
He's got a great sense of humour, and you can say a lot of things to Richard and he'll come back with a lovely turn of phrase and a cast iron commitment. And it's very simple. He says, I'll do all I can to defend the right people. And he regards Israel and Jewish people as those to defend. And I watched him talk to another Christian group, and he said, I'm not a Christian Zionist, I'm a Zionist who is Christian. And I think I understand exactly what he means by that, and I'm sure your viewers do too. He is generous of his time, generous of great spirit. The first time we ever met, he invited me to Colchester, to his hometown, to meet him. I've met him in Tel Aviv. He talks, whenever he's insulted online, or they think it's an insult, they accuse him of being Jewish. He'll say, no, I don't have that honor. I mean, that's the way he deals with those trolls, and you know, I asked him once. I said, well, you know, why do you do this? You know, you're a member of, you know, the English establishment in many ways. I think he's trying to disavow himself with what he believes in of being that person, but he is part of the English establishment. He was the head of Cobra, and of course he was commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and he has a distinguished military career. I said, why do you support these crazy people a long way away? To which he answered, well, they're certainly crazy, but he, you know, this is his belief and his philosophy, and he believes in the right things. He spends an inordinate amount of time in Israel, and he campaigns for peace. So it's not just about the Jewish people of Israel, it's about the Arab people of Israel, the Muslim people of Israel, the Christian people of Israel. He goes and supports the Arab Muslims who come from, you know, the toughest edges of town, who have literally been forced out of their families because they serve in the IDF. And those people are special heroes. And there are many, many people like that. I mean, there is a population of near on 2 million Israeli Arabs who they may not class themselves as Zionists as such, but they're certainly supporters of the State of Israel and its democratic and peace-loving values.
Excellent. So let's have a look at Jonny Gould interviewing Colonel Richard Kemp on his podcast.
This is Jonny Gould's Jewish State.
Here's Colonel Richard Kemp with his unique perspective on COVID-19, via his former role as chair of Cobra's national security in the UK and his intimate knowledge of Israel's history and culture. And what should the Biden administration do with China and Iran?
As always, it is my pleasure to welcome Colonel Richard Kemp to Jonny Gould's Jewish State. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Johnny. It's a real pleasure to be back with you yet again on your marvellous programme.
You're winning your third cap today, which is unprecedented. And today we're talking about national security. Now, of course, you were a member of Cobra, the government's top-level crisis management committee. Health really is as much an issue of national security as counter-terrorism. And so I guess the first question is, are the most successful nations in vaccinating their populations those which apply the values of defence against other security threats?
I think there's a very good point you make there, a good question you ask. And I think we can look at the responses of a number of countries in the world to coronavirus in terms of their control measures to try and reduce it, and also their what we know of their plans to vaccinate against it. And one thing we have seen is the effectiveness of authoritarian states at dealing with this. Now, of course, that effectiveness does come at a price. They can simply command people to do whatever it is they want them to do, and they will do it by and large. And they don't need to worry about what the media say. They don't need to worry about, because they control the media, of course. They don't need to worry about opposition because there isn't any significant opposition. So they simply can organise things in a very authoritarian, dictatorial way, as they do everything else. And in many cases, that's been shown to be effective, which you'd expect. Now, of course, the price you pay for that in the entire life of your society is certainly not worth what you gain in a crisis like this.
And there we have the great Colonel Richard Kemp, who's an incredible spokesman on behalf of Israel, and his love for the Jewish people is just incredible. We're down to the last few minutes, and because I could do 2 programmes with you, if not 3 programmes with you, Jonny, we've been a little bit limited to time. Now, as a sports broadcaster, I want to know your reaction to the exciting news that Israel could possibly host the 2030 World Cup. And having been a big football fan, having seen England play Israel in Tel Aviv for the 2007 European Championships, and the great hospitality that the Israelis provided the England fans, and they're not used to that, that the England fans at Ramat Gan Stadium actually clapped the Israeli national anthem, the Hatikva, shows that Israel would be a great host when it comes to hosting the World Cup. What are your thoughts?
I'm absolutely stunned at what Gianni Infantino said, the FIFA chief executive. He went over to Israel to look at the stadia, and I've been to the Bloomfield, which is the home of Hapoel Tel Aviv. I went in 2010, and then again 8 years later. It was a bit of a tip in the early days. I quite like tips because you get a real flavour of the football and the fans, but they've done it up and it looks a whole lot better. There's some beautiful stadia right across Israel, but it's a joint bid, and it's about Jordan and it's about the Abraham Accords countries. And Infantino can believe that it is possible after the North American World Cup, which is going to be staged between US, Canada and Mexico in 26, that it might come in 2030. And of course, the next one coming up is the Qatar World Cup. So after a bit of a moratorium of it being in the Middle East twice in 2 World Cups, goes to North America, returns back to, again, a new world, as it were. I don't think we're going to see Israel win the World Cup, but it would be very nice to have the world go there. And what a massive achievement. I'm going to quote that score again, because under John Kerry and the guys on the Democrat side, the Oslo Accords would not have achieved that peace, and indeed they haven't done as much as the Abraham Accords have. So the score, Abraham Accords 1, Oslo Accords 0. The idea that even saying those words is a real victory for peace in the world, for peace in the Middle East. The Palestinian delegation didn't like it, and they called the meeting off. If I was a Palestinian, I'm not a Palestinian, of course, I would ensure that that meeting went ahead. But all they want to do is cancel it because of that uttering. He's not taking sides. He's taking sides for all humanity. I really believe that.
I know that England is also putting in a bid with the Republic of Ireland to host the 2030 World Cup, and however much I'd love to see the World Cup back in this soil, because I wasn't alive during that great triumph of '66. My dad was, and his generation were privileged to see England win a World Cup. I think it would be great for Israel to host a World Cup, primarily because then the world would see the real Israel. And football fans as well, knowing how much the Israelis love their football, to have Israel being one of the host nations of a World Cup would transform Israel's image around the world.
Absolutely. Now, the Under-21 Championship was hosted in Israel several years ago, so the stadia had to be up to it. Obviously, there would be hundreds of thousands of more fans there. Israel staged the Eurovision a couple of years ago before the pandemic. We had a little bit of a protest from the Icelandic entry there, which was a bit ugly, and I presume that there would be an attempt at delegitimization. There would be, in a liberal society, which Israel is, there would be people there. But the idea, the chance, the dream that Israel could, with its Arab neighbors, stage, because that's the significant thing. It's not just about Israel. It's about the Gulf countries coming together. It's about Egypt, about Jordan. Let's have a stadium in each of the countries hosting this for a truly remarkable gesture.
And the final in Jerusalem. How's that?
Amazing. I'll see you there.
Definitely. John, I have to ask a very important question, I think, for our viewers as well, who've been thoroughly entertained by your appearance on the Middle East Report. How can they watch Jonny Gould's Jewish State podcast?
Well, it's primarily an audio podcast, so as you very kindly showed, I have a YouTube channel of a few of the videos, but there are 75 episodes available. Just search out Jonny Gould's Jewish State, no H in Johnny, Jonny Gould's Jewish State, and you'll find it on Apple, you'll find it on Spotify, you'll find it on SoundCloud and TuneIn, and wherever you get your podcasts, and you're most welcome. And if you drop me an email or you drop me a note on Twitter, you follow me on Twitter, I will reply to you. I'm always keen. It's a two-way street. That's the thing about podcasting. People are trained just to listen, our generation in particular, but it is a two-way conversation. Any questions that you've got for future guests, I'd love to hear it. Anything you've got to say about previous guests, even guests from 2 years ago, I want to hear them. It is, as I say, a two-way street dialogue. It's all about jaw.
Excellent. And also the important question is, we've got so many of our viewers who have a deep passion and love for Israel and the Jewish people. What role do you think Christians can play really in defending Israel and also speaking up on behalf of the Jewish community in this country that faces unprecedented threat with the rise of Jew hatred in this country right now?
I think once people of any religion, not just Christian people, but people of any religion, understand that the existential threat is owned by all of us to take responsibility for the values of the society that we are part of. Once we understand that we are all together in this, that the good things that we believe in are universal human values, then the decision to defend the Jewish state and defend your fellow Jewish neighbor becomes a more simple one. But it's not just about Jewish people, it's about law-abiding good Hindu people, Muslim people, Sikh people, the whole shooting match, as it were. I mean, we are living in a pluralistic society. We're all different. And I think that's really one of the beauties of our society when it functions well, when we have people of goodwill who really believe in those things. And, we honour the memory of Sir David Amis, who really believed those things.
Jonny, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report, and I want to thank you for watching this special programme. I think it's imperative that we talk about how Israel is so committed to peace, that Israel would make a great host in hosting the World Cup together with their newfound friends in the Middle East, and wouldn't that send a very powerful message to those Israel haters and the BDS? So let's continue to pray and support Israel and the Jewish people. So thank you for watching this edition of the Middle East Report.